We have seen China suffer devastating rebellions such as the Taiping rebellion. The country suffered a humiliating defeat after the Sino-Japanese War, and the Boxer Rebellion saw China suffer massive losses at the hand of 8 different nations. And yet, the Qing dynasty was still standing after all that had happened. The Qing embarked on a period of institutional and social reforms. These reforms, however, were an exemplary case of too little, too late, and the once mighty Qing dynasty would survive for just little under a decade. Following the Chinese defeat after the Boxer Rebellion, the imperial Qing court was convinced a new approach was required for its reign to continue. This conviction bore a bit of resemblance with the attitude after China got defeated during the Second Opium War in 1860. As a result, during this period until 1911, many reforms proposed in 1898 were now realized. Ironically, Empress Dowager Cixi and her conservative allies launched a coup against these reformers under the Guangxu Emperor in 1898 and deposed of them. The irony is hopefully not lost on many. These reforms would be implemented, though it would not be enough to save the Qing dynasty. Consider it political quicksand. The more the dynasty attempted to save itself, the deeper it sank. During the Boxer Rebellion, several governor-generals of provinces remained neutral towards both foreign powers, Boxers, and the Qing dynasty. Among these were Chiang Chi-tung and Liu Kuni, two of the most famous officials during that time. These men now presented 3 joint memorials to Empress Dowager Cixi in which they outlined a program that was reminiscent of the 100 Days Reform. With several understatements apparent in the text, they still managed to point out the dire situation the Qing dynasty found itself in and convinced Cixi of the necessity of reform. Now, China's example when it came to modernization was its island neighbor, Japan. Reason for this was that the island seemed to have discovered the answer to Western aggression and encroachment. During the Sino-Japanese War, it already showcased its superiority in military tactics and equipment. The years after, Japan agreed to treaties with Western powers that weren't on unequal footing, like the other Asian powers had been forced to sign. One of the most telling was the 1902 Anglo-Japanese alliance. Japan could take a tougher stance against Russia, with whom it had tense relations due to the Russians not only withholding Port Arthur from the Japanese after the Sino-Japanese War, but occupying the Liaodong Peninsula themselves several years later. And if you remember the video about the geopolitics preceding the Sino-Japanese War, both countries were still dead set on gaining influence in Korea and Manchuria. Russian troops in Manchuria eventually led to the Russo-Japanese War. If you're interested in a more detailed background, I've made 2 videos about that. Japan defeated Russia, and the war saw the largest battle in the world to date. Japan's victory impressed all Asian nations, as it was the first time in modern times a Western power was defeated by an Asian one. In China especially, Japan became even more of an example for reforms. At the top of the long list of reforms proposed to Empress Dowager Cixi was the reform of education in order to create a new, competent elite. Immediately after 1900, the government embarked on a thorough reform of education. It adhered to the traditional Chinese notion that recruiting talent is the most important element to realize good governance. What's interesting is that the Japanese educational system became the blueprint, and China attempted to attract Japanese teachers. Back in 1898, a modern imperial university was established in Beijing, the Beida. The Qing government invested heavily in erecting modern schools, although at its core the system remained weak. These modern schools, it was thought, would supplant the traditional examination system in a decade. The traditional system could not be abolished immediately due to the scholar officials with vested interest in it. After all, they enjoyed a natural dominance in both urban and rural areas due to exactly that system. The goal of the modern schools was not to educate the Chinese masses, nor a liberal education of the individual. It was to train and select officials more effectively. One of the first steps of modernity was the abolition of the traditional 8-legged essay. It had existed for nearly 5 centuries by that point. Unfortunately, the traditional route of education remained cheaper than the costly new modern schooling. Officials shunned the new government schools, and to top it all off, the new schools faced tough competition from Western missionary schools, established in strategic treaty ports and cities. Private enterprises also spurred up. A perfect example are the Changpo Ling and Yan Xiu, who opened a middle school in Tianjin acquiring a campus over the years, eventually growing into the Nankai University. Right. So I mentioned that Japan was an example to China when it came to modernization. Well, Chiang Kai-shek sent 2 missions to Japan in order to study its educational system and import its textbooks. Japanese professors were imported to China as well, and Chiang started to see Japan as a more favored training ground for teachers as opposed to Europe. It was cheaper. There obviously was a similar cultural element, and many Western books had already been translated to Japanese. After Japan won the Russo-Japanese War, the Chinese program for educational modernization accelerated, and the state exam system was formally abolished that same year. This event cannot be emphasized enough. It basically tore away the fundamental Confucianist basis China was built on. Traditional education made way for a mixed Sino-Western curriculum. Western works were translated to Chinese by, among others, Lin Shu and Yan Fu. The latter concluded that the secret to Western power was in Western thought. He translated Huxley, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, Montesquieu, and many others. It truly was a massive shift in Chinese thought and education. Before 1905, several important reforms had already been issued. First of all, the central governmental apparatus was modernized. The ancient 6-ministry organ was supplemented with several other ministries, such as education, foreign affairs, trade, police, and industry. Attempts to adequately manage government funds met with much resistance from those that were personally benefited from the traditional tax law. The Qing government faced much resistance from the provincial authorities as well, as these felt their autonomy was directly threatened by the centralization of power. A more modest attempt was made to reform Chinese law. This reform was absolutely necessary if the Western powers would ever want to cede their extraterritorial rights. The modernization of the army was rather successful. Many civil servants tasked with raising troops used Japanese knowledge, experience, and officers, while Chinese officers such as no other than Chiang Kai-shek traveled to Japan in 1907 to receive advanced military education. Now, the following is an interesting story about Chinese military. By 1901, there were 3 main types of military organizations. The traditional Manchu banner forces together with the decentralized Chinese constabulary, the Army of the Green Standard. These were pretty much useless and backward compared to modern military forces. Archery, sword brandishing, and lifting a heavy stone were criteria to be selected as a soldier. You can imagine that these ancient rituals were of no use against a modern force. The second military force in China were regional armies under control by Chinese civil officials. Examples are the Yunnan army built by Zheng Guofan during the Taiping rebellion. While it had been formally disbanded, together with Li Hongzhang's Anhui army, these forces continued to exist. These soldiers were regionally recruited and weren't part-time farmer soldiers, but professional fighters, also referred to as braves. The umbrella term for these forces, and I've named 2, but there were several more, was the defense army. There was rivalry among these forces and they lacked standardized armament, though they had more modern Western weaponry as compared to the Manchu banners. The last one was a military organization created in response to Japanese aggression. In the 1880s, Li Hongzhang and Chiang Kai-shek set up military academies and hired German officers to train their new Chinese forces. While Chiang created an army based on the German model in Nanking, the unit developed under Yuan Shikai was more significant. We met him in Korea around 20 years ago as Li's pro-consul, but he now laid the basis of the so-called Peiyang clique and became the father of the warlords. That's no understatement. Among his early officers, at least 10 of them would become military governors after the Qing Revolution, and 5 became presidents or premiers of the Beijing government under the Republic. His army was the most disciplined, modernized, and best paid. After Li Hongzhang and Liu Kuni died in 1901 and 1902 respectively, Yuan Shikai was the chief army builder. As you can imagine, we will hear much more from Yuan at later stages. After the Boxer Rebellion, the early stages of a modern economy became visible. During the Peace of Shimonoseki in 1895, Japan enforced their right to establish factories at treaty ports. Thanks to the Most Favored Nations clause, other countries could now establish their own factories in these areas as well. Foreign industrial activities using cheap Chinese labor stimulated Chinese competition. After 1900, this growth expanded, though still modest, from the treaty ports to Chinese companies more inland. Everywhere in China, chambers of commerce were established, and once the Ministry of Trade and Industry was created, this economical development was stimulated even more. During the last decade, the Qing dynasty was in power. The cleavage between the gentry and merchants and industrialists started to fade. The gentry started to focus on trading and industrial endeavors, which was indirectly stimulated by the abolishing of the state exam system. Meanwhile, the loyalty towards the Qing dynasty started to weaken even more, as more Chinese gentry, but other classes as well, started to prioritize their own regional economic fortunes over dynastic stability. The Qing government attempted to solidify the support they enjoyed, and during this process, it became very clear the loyalty of its citizens had been worn down. After Japan defeated Russia in 1905, constitutionalism seemed to be the type of government that provided the basis for unity between rulers and ruled. This notion was underpinned not just due to Japan's constitutionalism. Now, Russia, as a result of losing the war, made plans to move towards a parliamentary government via the Duma themselves. I have detailed Russia's first parliament and constitution in a separate video if that interests you. The Qing issued representative bodies for which Japan once again served as the blueprint. Empress Dowager Cixi announced in 1908 the incremental introduction of a constitution and parliament. The transition period would be 9 years, just like in Japan, where a parliament was promised in 1880 and it finally met in 1889. The first step would be the implementation of a provincial assembly in 1909, whereas Chiang Kai-shek sent 2 delegations to Japan to study the educational system. The Qing court sent 2 delegations to Europe and the United States, and 1 to Japan. The delegates met with Prince Ito, the president of the advisory council to the emperor. Ito emphasized the importance of an emperor maintaining supreme power, standing above the population, if you will, while promoting crucial elements such as public debate. But rather important and game-changing, that same year, in 1908, Empress Dowager Cixi passed away. But there was an emperor dethroned during the conservative coup 10 years earlier, right? Emperor Guangxi, who was only 37 and didn't suffer from health problems. Well, he died under mysterious circumstances, exactly 1 day before Cixi passed away. Cixi had, in fact, appointed a 3-year-old Puyi as her successor. Prince Chun, Puyi's father, became the prince regent. Prince Chun barely managed to influence Chinese policy, and the de facto strongest man of the country was General Yuan Shikai. While Yuan offered his services to the emperor, Prince Chun feared Yuan's influence, dismissing him. Yuan complied, though bitterly offended. Dismissing Yuan would have far-reaching consequences for the Qing dynasty. Chiang Kai-shek died in October that same year. Alright, so the Qing dynasty faced another problem when it came to administrative function. The central administration was reorganized under the aforementioned 11 ministries, but the Qing did not want to create an agency to control and coordinate these ministries. Simply put, the person at its head would assume too much power. The representative of all 16 new provincial assemblies, however, did meet, and its delegates turned out to be rather unruly and difficult to control. Regional interests trumped national interests, and the delegates demanded to speed up the establishment of the constitution and parliament. In turn, parliamentary representation was promised by the regent, Prince Chun, to be realized by 1913 instead of 17. In 1911, the first minister cabinet was established by Prince Chun, though it didn't really work in favor for the dynasty. Fairbank and Reischauer write that, with incredible ineptitude, he appointed 8 Manchus, 1 Mongol bannerman, and only 4 Chinese. It was one of the last twitches of the dying dynasty. Provincial versus central interests came to a climax over railway building. Western powers had managed to acquire rights to establish and control their own railways. As these railways were considered the tools of economic imperialism, the local Chinese gentry and merchants started to gather their own funds to establish their railways. This patriotic rights recovery movement did so in 2 ways. They either bought foreign railway companies, if possible, and secondly, they funded the actual building of Chinese railroads. The Qing government feared that these local initiatives to establish railways would further weaken the dynasty. And just as important, the dynasty itself did not have enough funds to start working on a national railroad. The funds that it did have were managed by corrupt officials. All these reasons led to the decision to nationalize the railroads in 1910. Funds once again proved the biggest obstacle, though. Under Sheng Xuanhai, centralization of railways had, in part, already taken place, and he now agreed to a loan from a group of foreign bankers, the so-called consortium. The final contract by the consortium coincided with an imperial decree advocated by Sheng, which nationalized and bought out all local railroads, bringing them under Beijing supervision. A wave of protests erupted, and if you ponder on this act for a little, I'd imagine you too come to the conclusion that in essence it seemed that Shang, and by extension the Qing, were selling China to foreign bankers. In order to prevent this nationalization of railways, riots erupted in Sichuan in 1911, which quickly spiraled out of control. This time the gentry took a leading role in the rebellion. The fatal blow the Qing government received was an unexpected and unplanned military riot in Wuchang on the 11th of October 1911. This riot spread at such a fast pace that all the Qing court could do was call upon Yuan Shikai. Today has been all about the failed reforms the Qing issued the decade after the Boxer Rebellion. These reforms were too little, too late. Next week we'll look at the Wuchang Rebellion, which was the catalyst of the Xinhai Rebellion, the end of empire and abdication of Puyi, the last emperor, which would follow shortly. If you want to know what happened in the decades preceding the collapse of the Qing dynasty, consider checking out the playlist on the screen detailing the history of the Qing dynasty from around the Taiping Rebellion and Opium Wars all the way to its eventual downfall. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.